Title: A Family Affair. The Bakers had always dreamed of a perfect European vacation. Paris, Rome, Barcelona. The itinerary was packed with picture-perfect destinations. From the outside, they looked like the ideal American family. Tom, the hard-working businessman. Sarah, the devoted mother. Nick, their brooding teenager. And little Emma, the bright-eyed youngest. But behind the carefully curated Instagram posts and scenic backdrops, the truth was far messier than it seemed. Day 1. Arrival in Paris. The moment they landed at Charles de Gaulle Airport, Sarah felt a familiar rush of anticipation. It wasn't just the excitement of travel. It was something more dangerous. Her phone buzzed discreetly in her purse. She ignored it, but she knew who it was. Ethan. She had met him months ago in an online travel forum. What started as innocent conversation about French cuisine evolved into late-night messages, inside jokes, and, eventually, the dangerous promise of meeting in person. She had convinced herself it was harmless. After all, she loved Tom, didn't she? Meanwhile, Tom was dealing with his own secrecy. Every few hours, he found excuses to step away, taking hush phone calls that he claimed were work emergencies. He hadn't told Sarah the truth. His business trip to London before this vacation hadn't been about business at all. A woman named Claire was waiting for him in Paris, expecting a goodbye he wasn't ready to give. Nick, their 16-year-old son, had grown suspicious. He wasn't dumb. He noticed how his mom was extra careful with her phone lately, how his dad was disappearing more than usual. But it wasn't until he borrowed his mom's iPad to check something online that he saw the messages. Ethan, can't wait to see you in Paris. I'll be at the cafe near the Seine at 4 p.m. Nick's stomach twisted. He knew what he had just discovered, but he didn't know what to do with it. Day 3. The cracks begin to show. On the third day, the family took a scenic boat ride on the Seine. Sarah's nerves were on edge. She was supposed to meet Ethan later, and the weight of her deception was beginning to sink in. Tom, on the other hand, was preoccupied with sneaking glances at his phone, waiting for an update from Claire, who was getting impatient. Nick, fueled by growing resentment, decided to test his mother. "Hey, Mom," he said casually, "I read somewhere that there's a really famous cafe near the Seine. Maybe we should go check it out." Sarah stiffened. "Oh, I don't know, maybe another day." "Why not today?" Nick pressed. Sarah glanced at Tom, who was lost in his own world. "We'll see," she muttered, avoiding her son's gaze. That night, Emma, blissfully unaware of the tension brewing around her, posted a family photo from the boat ride. A picturesque moment, with the Eiffel Tower glowing in the background. But in the reflection of the boat's glass railing, something caught the eye of a follower. A woman in the distance, staring at the family with too much familiarity. Day 5, the storm breaks. By the time they reached Lyon, everything unraveled. Claire had seen Emma's Instagram post. She had found them, and she wasn't coming quietly. Nick, unable to hold back any longer, confronted his mother about Ethan. "I know you're meeting someone," he said. "I saw the messages." Sarah went pale. "Nick, it's not what you think. It's exactly what I think. And Dad's not innocent either. He's been sneaking off too. Are you guys even here for us? Or just for your little affairs?" Tom entered the room just in time to hear his son's accusation. "Nick, that's enough." "Is it?" Nick shot back. "Because I think it's time we all start telling the truth." The air in the hotel room was suffocating. Emma, clutching her stuffed animal, looked between her parents in confusion. "What's happening?" she asked in a small voice. At that moment, Claire knocked on the door. What happens next? The past had finally caught up with the Bakers, and now, standing in a foreign country, they were faced with a choice: continue the lies or face the truth, no matter how painful it would be. One thing was certain: this family vacation would be unforgettable for all the wrong reasons. Day 6. Truths unravel. The knock on the hotel room door was deafening. For a moment, no one moved. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. Tom clenched his jaw. Nick folded his arms, waiting to see what would happen next. Emma, oblivious to the tension, sat on the bed, kicking her legs against the suitcase. Tom was the first to react. He strode to the door, yanked it open, and there she was, Claire. Tall, striking, with a sharp gaze that flickered between anger and heartbreak. "Surprise," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Sarah, still processing the situation, took a step back. "Who is this?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Tom sighed, running a hand down his face. "Claire, this isn't the time." "Not the time." Claire laughed bitterly. "You've been ignoring me for days, and now I see this." She gestured toward the inside of the hotel room, toward Sarah, toward their children. "Was this your work trip, Tom?" Nick exhaled sharply. Wow. So it's true." He turned to Sarah. "And you were going to meet your little side guy today, too, weren't you?" Sarah's face burned. "Nick, this isn't your business." Nick scoffed. "It is my business. You two dragged us on this fake family vacation while sneaking around behind each other's backs. God, no wonder you both were so distracted." Claire crossed her arms, her eyes locked on Tom. "So, are you going to tell her, or should I?" "Tell me what?" Sarah snapped, the frustration finally breaking through her composed exterior. Tom inhaled sharply. He looked at his wife, then at his son, and then at the floor. "Claire and I, we had a thing. It started on my business trip to London." Sarah let out a bitter laugh. "A thing?" Her hands trembled as she clenched them into fists. "You mean an affair?" Tom nodded, ashamed. "And what now?" Sarah continued, her voice rising. "You were just going to sneak off with her in Paris while I—" She stopped herself before finishing the sentence, realizing that she wasn't exactly innocent either. Nick turned to his mother. "While you what?" Sarah swallowed hard, shaking her head. "Nothing. It doesn't matter." But Nick wasn't letting this slide. "Oh, it matters. You were planning to meet someone too, weren't you?" The silence was enough of an answer. Claire, watching the family explode, exhaled dramatically. "Wow. So it's not just him." She turned to Tom. "Guess you two deserve each other." Emma, frowning in confusion, finally spoke up. "Are you guys fighting?" Sarah closed her eyes. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. The picture-perfect vacation, the curated memories, it was all a lie. And now, that lie had shattered beyond repair. Tom sighed, looking at his youngest daughter. "No, sweetheart, we're just—" "Yes," Nick cut in. "Yes, they're fighting, because neither of them can keep a promise. And now we're all stuck here, watching it fall apart." Sarah sat down, her hands over her face. "We need to talk," she whispered. "All of us." Tom hesitated, but eventually nodded. Claire, realizing she had overstayed her welcome, scoffed. "Right, I'll leave you to it." She shot one last glare at Tom before turning and disappearing down the hallway. The door clicked shut, and then, for the first time in years, the Bakers had the conversation they had all been avoiding. One filled with anger, with regret, with painful truths, and maybe, just maybe, a glimmer of hope. Because now, finally, there were no more lies left to tell. Day 7, the fallout begins. The morning after the confrontation was suffocatingly quiet. No one spoke over breakfast. Tom stirred his coffee without drinking it. Sarah stared blankly at a croissant she hadn't touched. Nick scrolled aimlessly on his phone, his jaw clenched, while Emma, sensing the tension, simply picked at her pancakes. It was as if their entire world had shifted overnight, and no one knew how to move forward. Then Sarah's phone buzzed. She snatched it up instinctively, expecting another message from Ethan. Instead, it was an unknown number. "Unknown, I saw your little family moment at the hotel last night. Looks like your perfect trip isn't so perfect after all." Sarah's stomach turned. She reread the message, her pulse quickening. Who was this? How did they know? Before she could respond, another text came in. "Unknown. Meet me at Place Belcour in 1 hour. Alone." Sarah's throat went dry. She quickly turned off the screen, but Nick caught the flicker of panic in her eyes. "Who was that?" he asked, his voice sharp. "Work," she lied. "Just a client needing something." Nick scoffed, shaking his head. "Yeah, sure." Tom, still avoiding eye contact, muttered, "Maybe we should head to the train station. Get out of Lyon." Sarah hesitated. Something about that message felt more than just a threat. It felt personal. Someone was watching them. She forced a smile. "You guys go ahead. I just need to handle something first." Tom frowned but didn't argue. He was too drained for another fight. Place Belcour, 10:45 a.m. Sarah arrived at the massive square, her eyes scanning the crowd. It was bustling with tourists, cyclists, street performers. Anyone could have sent that text. Then she saw him, Ethan, sitting in an outdoor cafe, sunglasses on, one hand resting casually around his espresso cup. Her breath caught in her throat. She hadn't seen him in person before, just pictures, late-night video calls. But here he was, real, and more dangerous than she'd imagined. "You came," he said smoothly, not even looking up as she approached. Sarah pulled out the chair across from him, but didn't sit. "Was that you who texted me?" Ethan smirked, finally lifting his gaze. "Of course not. But I have a feeling you've made some enemies lately." Sarah swallowed hard. "What do you mean?" He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "I mean, someone's been following you. I noticed last night, outside your hotel. A man, watching from across the street. He wasn't just curious. He knew you." Sarah's skin prickled. "Who?" Ethan shook his head. "No idea. But whoever it is, they're not just after you. They're watching your whole family." Her hands clenched into fists. "Why are you telling me this?" Ethan chuckled. "Because, sweetheart, you and I, we're in this together now." Sarah's stomach twisted. This wasn't just an affair anymore. This was something far more dangerous. And someone out there knew exactly what she had done. Day 7, the game begins. Sarah's pulse pounded in her ears. She glanced over her shoulder, scanning the crowd, but she saw nothing unusual, just tourists, locals, the usual flow of a European city. And yet, a chill ran down her spine. She leaned in. "You expect me to believe you just happened to notice someone watching my family?" Ethan smirked, swirling his espresso lazily. "I pay attention to details, Sarah. It's why you like talking to me in the first place, remember?" She did. Ethan had always been perceptive, reading between the lines of her messages, saying things she hadn't even realized she was thinking. But this was something else. Whoever it was, Ethan continued. They were careful, but not careful enough. "I saw him outside your hotel. He was there when you and your husband were having your moment." Sarah stiffened. "You saw that?" "Oh, sweetheart," he said, leaning back. "I saw everything." Her blood ran cold. "Why were you even there?" Ethan chuckled. "Did you really think I wouldn't come check on you? After all our plans? After all our—" He stopped, lowering his voice. "I needed to see you, and I'm glad I did, because now I know that we've got a problem." Sarah's mind raced. Someone had been watching them. But who? Tom's mistress? A private investigator? Someone from Ethan's past? She forced herself to stay calm. "What do you want, Ethan?" Ethan's smirk faded, and for the first time, his expression turned serious. "To help you. I don't know who this guy is, but I know trouble when I see it. And Sarah, you're in deep." She exhaled sharply, standing. "I need to get back to my family." Ethan grabbed her wrist, gently but firmly. "Be careful," he warned. "You're not the only one keeping secrets." Sarah yanked her arm away, her heart slamming against her ribs. She turned and walked away, but every step felt heavier than the last. Meanwhile, back at the hotel, Nick sat in the lobby, pretending to scroll through his phone while he watched his father. Tom was standing near the front desk, speaking quietly to someone on the phone. Nick knew that look. His dad wasn't talking to a colleague. He was talking to her. After last night, Nick thought his dad would have ended it. But clearly old habits died hard. Nick clenched his jaw and stood. He wasn't going to just sit here and watch his family fall apart. He was going to do something about it. He slipped out of the hotel unnoticed, hailing a cab. "Where to?" the driver asked. Nick hesitated for only a second before saying, "Place Belcourt. 11:30 a.m., the confrontation." Sarah had barely made it halfway back to the hotel when she spotted Nick stepping out of a taxi. Her stomach dropped. "Nick," she called, rushing toward him. "What are you doing here?" Nick's eyes burned with betrayal. "What are you doing here?" Sarah froze. He looked past her, and when his gaze landed on Ethan, who was still sitting at the cafe, watching them with a knowing smirk, Nick's face twisted in realization. "Oh my God," he muttered. "It's him, isn't it?" Sarah reached for him. "Nick, please, I can explain." "Explain what?" he snapped, his voice rising. "That you've been sneaking around with some guy behind Dad's back? That you're just as bad as him?" Sarah felt her world tilting. "It's not what you think." Nick let out a cold laugh. "It never is." Before she could stop him, He turned and stormed away. Sarah stood frozen in place, her breath shallow. Ethan strolled up beside her, hands in his pockets. "Well," he said, "that went well." Sarah shot him a glare. "Shut up." Ethan smirked. "We should probably go after him before he does something stupid." Sarah hesitated. Then, with a deep breath, she ran after her son. Ethan followed. 11:45 a.m. The shadow in the crowd. Nick weaved through the crowded square, furious and heartbroken. He couldn't go back to the hotel. He couldn't deal with his parents. He just needed space. But as he turned down a narrow side street, he felt it. Someone was watching him. His stomach clenched. He slowed his pace, glancing over his shoulder. A man in a dark coat, standing near a street vendor, pretending to be looking at postcards. Nick's pulse spiked. The man lifted his phone, angling it ever so slightly, like he was taking pictures. Nick's blood ran cold. He wasn't being paranoid. Someone was following them. Day 7. The hunter in the shadows. Nick's pulse hammered in his ears. He turned his head forward and picked up his pace, forcing himself to stay calm. Maybe he was overreacting. Maybe this guy was just a random tourist. But then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw the man move. Not casually, not aimlessly, deliberately. Nick made a split-second decision. He turned sharply down a narrow alley, heart pounding. If this guy wasn't following him, he'd keep walking past the street. 5 seconds passed, then 10. Nick dared a glance back. The man was there, still following. Nick's stomach dropped. 11:50 a.m. Sarah and Ethan give chase. Sarah pushed through the crowded square, her breath coming fast. She was barely keeping up with Nick, who had taken off like a bullet. Ethan jogged beside her. "He's fast," he muttered. "Yeah," Sarah snapped. "Because he's furious. I meant it as a compliment." Sarah shot him a glare. "Shut up and help me find him." Ethan smirked but didn't argue. His eyes scanned the crowd, sharp and assessing. Then he pointed. "There." Sarah followed his gaze. Down a side street, she caught a glimpse of Nick disappearing around a corner. But something else caught her attention. A dark figure, moving with purpose. Sarah's breath hitched. Nick wasn't running alone. Someone was following him. 11:55 a.m. The alleyway confrontation. Nick's breath was ragged as he came to a dead end. A tall brick wall blocked his path. His chest rose and fell rapidly as he turned around. The man in the dark coat stood at the entrance of the alley, blocking the way out. Nick's fingers twitched toward his phone. He had no idea who this guy was, but his gut screamed danger. The man took a step forward. "You shouldn't have run." Nick's blood turned to ice. "Who the hell are you?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his pocket. Nick's body tensed. His instinct screamed move. Before he could act, a voice rang out from behind. "Hey, Sarah." Nick barely had time to process before his mother and Ethan came barreling into the alley. The man stiffened, clearly not expecting backup. Sarah grabbed Nick's arm and yanked him behind her. Her heart pounded, but her voice was steady. "Who are you?" she demanded. The man hesitated. Then slowly he smiled. It was a cold smile. Calculated. "You've made quite a mess for yourselves," he said, his voice smooth and unnervingly calm. "Secrets. Affairs. Running from one city to the next." Sarah's breath caught. He knew. Ethan stepped forward, his expression shifting from relaxed amusement to something lethal. "You've got 5 seconds to start making sense before I decide you're not worth the trouble." The man chuckled. "Oh, I'm worth the trouble. But let's not get ahead of ourselves." He reached into his pocket again, this time slowly, deliberately. Sarah held her breath. Was it a gun? A weapon? The man pulled out a phone. He tapped the screen a few times, then turned it around. A photo appeared. A blurry shot of Sarah and Ethan at the cafe earlier. Another shot of Tom at the hotel on the phone. One of Nick stepping out of the taxi. The man tilted his head. "Someone's been keeping an eye on you." Sarah's skin prickled. "Who sent you?" The man's smirk widened. "You think I'm the only one watching? Sweetheart, you have no idea who you've pissed off." Nick swallowed hard. "What do you want?" The man slipped the phone back into his pocket. "I just deliver messages." Sarah clenched her fists. "What message?" The man's smile faded. "They know," he said simply. "And they're coming." A heavy silence filled the alley. Then, Without another word, the man turned and disappeared into the crowd. 12 p.m., the realization. Sarah stood frozen, her breath shaky. Nick's mind raced. They're coming. Who were they? Ethan let out a low whistle. Well, he muttered, that was ominous. Sarah turned to him, her eyes blazing. You knew something, didn't you? Ethan held up his hands. I suspected. But this is next level. Nick finally spoke. Mom, what the hell is going on? Sarah exhaled, rubbing her temples. I don't know, but she did know one thing. This wasn't just about cheating anymore. This was bigger, much bigger, and they were running out of time. Day 7, nowhere to hide. Sarah grabbed Nick's arm, her fingers digging into his sleeve. We need to leave. Now. Nick's heart was still racing. Mom, what the hell was that? Who knows? Who's coming? Ethan's eyes darkened. That guy wasn't bluffing. Someone's got eyes on your whole family. He turned to Sarah. Whatever mess you're tangled up in, it's about to get a whole lot worse. Sarah swallowed hard. She didn't have time for explanations. Not here. Not now. She turned on her heel and pulled Nick along, Ethan following closely behind. They pushed through the crowded streets, weaving between pedestrians, past cafes, and boutique shops. Sarah's mind raced. Who was watching them? Tom's mistress? Ethan's past mistakes? Someone she hadn't even considered? Her thoughts were cut short when Ethan suddenly yanked her backward, forcing her into a doorway. Wait. His voice was sharp, urgent. Sarah's pulse spiked. What? Ethan's gaze flicked past her, across the street. We're not alone. Sarah turned her head slightly, just enough to see. A black sedan idled near the curb. Tinted windows. The kind of car that didn't just happen to be parked there. Then movement. A man in a dark jacket stepped out from a nearby cafe, speaking into a phone as he scanned the crowd. Sarah's stomach dropped. Nick saw him too. Is that the same guy from the alley? Ethan shook his head. No, different guy. His jaw tightened, which means there's more than one. Sarah's breath hitched. They weren't just being watched. They were being hunted. 12:15 p.m., back at the hotel. Tom was pacing in the hotel room, gripping his phone so tightly his knuckles were white. Claire's voice on the other end was sharp. You're not answering my damn texts, Tom. Because I don't have time for this, he snapped. Something's wrong. Claire let out a cold laugh. Oh, now you're worried? Where was this energy when you were sneaking around with me? Tom squeezed his eyes shut. Listen to me. Someone's following us. That silenced her. After a moment, Claire's tone shifted. Following you? What do you mean? Tom ran a hand through his hair. I don't know, but something's happening. And I think, he hesitated, I think it has something to do with Sarah. Claire scoffed. Of course it does. Tom ignored the jab. She's hiding something. And whoever's after us, they're not playing games. There was a long pause. Then Claire spoke again, softer this time. Tom, I think I know who's after her. Tom froze. What? Claire inhaled sharply. Sarah's not the only one who's been lying to you. Tom's grip on his phone tightened. What the hell are you talking about, Claire? A hesitation. Then, I've seen her with him before. Tom's blood ran cold. With who? Claire's voice was barely above a whisper. Ethan. 12:30 p.m. The escape plan. Sarah pulled Nick into a side alley, pressing herself against the wall. Across the street, the man in the dark jacket was still scanning the crowd. We can't go back to the hotel, she said breathlessly. Nick exhaled sharply. Then where the hell are we going? Ethan, standing beside them, checked his watch. I have an idea. Sarah turned to him. I swear to God, if this is another one of your helpful suggestions. Ethan cut her off. Do you trust me or not? Sarah hesitated. Nick stared at them. Oh my God, you knew this guy before today, didn't you? Sarah closed her eyes for a second, then looked at her son. It's complicated. Nick scoffed. No, it's not. You were having an affair. Sarah flinched. It wasn't. Ethan clapped his hands once. Great. We can unpack the family drama later. Right now, we need to get out of here. Nick turned on him. Why should we trust you? Ethan sighed, then reached into his pocket. Sarah tensed, but instead of a weapon, he pulled out a folded slip of paper. An address. Ethan handed it to Sarah. There's a train leaving in 20 minutes. We need to be on it. Sarah glanced at the address. What's at this place? Ethan's expression darkened. Answers. Sarah hesitated, then nodded. She looked at Nick. Come on. Nick clenched his jaw, but followed. As they slipped through the alley, Ethan glanced back one last time. The man in the dark jacket was now talking to someone, and that someone was looking directly at them. 12:45 p.m., the call that changed everything. Tom was still gripping his phone, pacing the hotel room. Claire's words echoed in his head. I've seen her with him before. His mind was racing. If Claire was telling the truth, then Sarah's affair wasn't just about cheating. It was something else entirely. His phone buzzed. A blocked number. Tom hesitated, then answered. Hello. A distorted voice came through the line. Cold. Mechanical. You're running out of time, Mr. Baker. Tom's heart pounded. Who is this? You should have left Paris when you had the chance. Tom's blood turned to ice. Now it's too late. Day 7. The trap is closing. Tom gripped the phone, his breath shallow. Who are you? The distorted voice on the other end remained eerily calm. You already know the answer to that, Mr. Baker. The only real question is, what are you going to do about it? A sharp click. The line went dead. Tom stood frozen. His mind was racing, but the pieces weren't fitting together fast enough. If Claire was right, if Sarah had been involved with Ethan for longer than he thought, then this wasn't just about an affair. It was something far, far worse. A sinking realization settled in his gut. Sarah wasn't just hiding from him. She was running from something. And now so was he. Tom grabbed his suitcase and threw it onto the bed, hastily shoving in clothes. His hands were shaking. He needed to get out of this hotel. He needed to find Sarah. Then he stopped. Outside, just beyond the curtains, a black sedan had pulled up to the curb. The same one from before. His stomach dropped. They were already here. 1 p.m., the station. Sarah, Nick, and Ethan pushed through the crowds at Lyon's main train station. The air was thick with the scent of coffee and warm pastries, but Sarah could barely register it. Her heartbeat was in her throat. Ethan led them toward the departure board, scanning the listings. Train to Nice, Platform 6, he said. Leaves in 5 minutes. Sarah barely had time to think. Nice. South of France. A whole different city. Was this really the best move? Nick's voice broke through her thoughts. Mom, we can't just keep running. Sarah turned to him, eyes burning. We don't have a choice. Nick shook his head. No, you don't want to face Dad. You don't want to admit what you did. And now you're dragging us into something way bigger than just a stupid affair. Sarah's breath hitched. Nick, this is not just about your father. Nick's face hardened. Then tell me the truth. Right now. Sarah hesitated. Before she could answer, Ethan grabbed her wrist. We don't have time for this. He turned to Nick, voice sharp. You want answers? Get on the train. Sarah's stomach twisted. Nick's jaw clenched. No, I'm done being dragged around. A flicker of movement caught his eye. A man in a dark coat. Nick stiffened. Mom. Sarah followed his gaze, and her blood ran cold. 2 men, walking casually but too casually. One near the ticket counter, another near the escalators. Both watching them. Sarah felt like she couldn't breathe. They found us. Ethan cursed under his breath. Go. Now. Nick didn't argue this time. They pushed toward the train platform, just as an announcement crackled over the intercom. Train to Nice departing in 3 minutes. Sarah glanced back. The men were moving now, closing in. They're not stopping until they have us. Ethan shoved their tickets into the hands of the conductor and pulled Sarah onto the train. Nick followed, breathless. The doors slid shut behind them. The train lurched forward. They were moving. Sarah collapsed into a seat, her hands shaking. Nick sat across from her, eyes stormy. I want answers. Now. Ethan exhaled, rubbing his temples. Kid, trust me. No, Nick snapped. I'm done trusting you. His eyes flicked to his mother. Mom. Sarah inhaled sharply. And then, finally she spoke. This isn't about an affair. Nick's brows furrowed. Then what is it? Sarah met his gaze, her voice barely above a whisper. It's about what your father did. 1:30 p.m. Tom's escape. Tom shoved his suitcase into the back of a taxi, slamming the door behind him. Where to? The driver asked. Tom hesitated. Sarah wasn't picking up her phone. He had no idea where she was. But one thing was clear. He couldn't stay in Lyon. Then, suddenly a thought hit him. Claire. If she knew about Sarah and Ethan, maybe she knew more than she was letting on. He took a deep breath. Gare de Lyon. I need a train ticket to Nice. The driver nodded and pulled away from the curb. Tom exhaled, glancing in the rearview mirror. His stomach twisted. The black sedan was following them. 2 p.m. The secret comes out. Nick stared at his mother, stunned. What do you mean, what Dad did? Sarah hesitated. She wasn't sure how to say it. Ethan leaned back, arms crossed. Might as well tell him, Sarah. Kid deserves to know. Sarah swallowed. Then she said the words that changed everything. Your father stole money. A lot of money. From people he shouldn't have messed with. Nick blinked. Wait, what? Sarah nodded, her voice tight. I didn't know at first. But when I found out, I wanted to leave. That's when I met Ethan. Nick stared at Ethan now, disbelief in his eyes. So he helped you? Ethan smirked. Not exactly. Let's just say, I have my own reasons for wanting your dad's little friends to stay far away. Nick's head was spinning. So the people after us. They're not after me, Sarah said. They're after him. Nick exhaled sharply. And now we're all caught in the middle. Sarah's lips pressed together. Yes. Nick leaned back, raking a hand through his hair. Holy shit. Ethan smirked. Yeah. Welcome to the real world, kid. Nick clenched his jaw. His mother had lied. His father had stolen from the wrong people. And now, they were all running for their lives. 2:30 p.m. The chase continues. Tom stepped out of the taxi and into the train station, his heart hammering. He needed to get to Nice. He needed to find Sarah. But then, a hand clamped onto his shoulder. He barely had time to react before a voice whispered in his ear. Going somewhere, Mr. Baker. Tom's blood ran cold. Before he could turn, the world went dark. Day 7. The disappearance. Tom never saw it coming. 1 second, he was standing in the station. The next, a sharp pain exploded at the base of his skull, and everything went black. The last thing he heard before the darkness swallowed him. We finally found you. 3 p.m. on the train to Nice. Sarah sat stiffly in her seat, gripping the edge of the table in front of her. The train hummed beneath them, but the silence between her, Nick, and Ethan was unbearable. Nick had barely spoken since she told him the truth. His jaw was tight, his fists clenched on his lap. Finally, he exhaled sharply. So let me get this straight. Dad stole money. You found out. You got scared. And this guy, he jerked his thumb at Ethan, just so happened to show up in your life? Ethan chuckled. I wouldn't say just so happened. Let's call it a mutually beneficial arrangement. Nick scowled. That's not sketchy at all. Sarah rubbed her temples. I didn't know who Ethan really was at first. But once I did, Ethan interrupted, smirking. You stayed. Sarah shot him a glare. Nick leaned back, crossing his arms. And now these people, whoever Dad stole from, are after us. Sarah nodded. Nick scoffed. And Dad? What? He's just sitting back in a hotel while we run for our lives. Sarah hesitated. Something in her gut twisted. Tom should have called by now. She pulled out her phone and dialed his number. Voicemail. She tried again. Voicemail. A cold wave of fear washed over her. Nick watched her face carefully. Mom. Sarah lowered her phone, her hands trembling. Something's wrong. Ethan sighed. Of course it is. Sarah shot him a look. I mean it, Ethan. Tom's not answering. Ethan's smirk faded slightly. Could be nothing. Or, Sarah felt her stomach churn. Or, they had gotten to him. 3:15 p.m., the warehouse. Tom groaned as he came to. His head was pounding. His wrists ached, tightly bound behind his back. His surroundings were dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of dust and oil. A warehouse. A shadow moved in front of him. You've been a hard man to find, Mr. Baker. Tom's vision adjusted. A man stood before him, dressed in an expensive black suit. Late 40s, dark hair slicked back. Calculated. Cold. Tom's breath hitched. He knew who this was. Adrian Calloway, one of the men he had stolen from. Adrian crouched down, resting his elbows on his knees. I have to admit, I'm disappointed. I expected more from you, Tom. Running? Hiding. He sighed, shaking his head. It's pathetic. Tom swallowed hard. What do you want? Adrian smirked. Oh, I think you already know. He pulled out his phone and tapped the screen. A picture appeared. Sarah, Nick, Ethan, at the train station. Tom's stomach twisted. Adrian's smirk widened. They're on the move. But don't worry, Tom. His voice was almost mocking. We'll make sure they don't get too far. Tom's blood ran cold. No. Adrian tilted his head. No. Tom's voice was hoarse, desperate. They don't have anything to do with this. Just leave them out of it. Adrian chuckled. Oh, Tom, you really think this is about you anymore? He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. You had your chance to fix this. You didn't. Now, we take everything. Tom's pulse pounded in his ears. Sarah, Nick, Emma, they were all in danger. And there was nothing he could do. 3:30 p.m. The train is compromised. Sarah kept her eyes locked on the phone screen, willing it to ring. Nick tapped his foot anxiously. Mom, what if? The train doors hissed open at a small station. More passengers boarded, shuffling through the aisle. And then, Sarah's breath caught. A man in a dark suit stepped onto the train, followed by another. Her grip tightened on the table. Ethan cursed under his breath. Looks like we have company. Nick swallowed hard. Are they looking for us? Sarah didn't answer. She didn't have to. One of the men lifted a phone to his ear, his gaze sweeping the train car. Sarah knew that look. They weren't looking. They were hunting. Ethan leaned in, his voice low. If we stay put, we're screwed. Sarah's mind raced. They needed to get off this train. But how? Nick's voice was barely above a whisper. Mom, what do we do? Sarah exhaled, forcing herself to stay calm. Then she met Ethan's gaze. Guess off this train. 3:32 p.m. Nowhere to run. Ethan's jaw tightened. He glanced around the train car, calculating. All right, he muttered. This is going to suck. Sarah's heart pounded. Just tell me what to do. Ethan's eyes flicked toward the two men slowly making their way down the aisle. He spoke quickly, keeping his voice low. They're scanning faces. We have maybe a minute before they recognize us. Nick shifted uneasily. So what's the plan? Ethan exhaled sharply. We need to move. Now. Sarah glanced at the train doors. But we're moving. Not for long. Ethan interrupted. He pointed toward the next car. Go. Walk like we belong there. Sarah grabbed Nick's arm, and the three of them stood up casually. She forced herself to breathe evenly, to act like nothing was wrong. As they moved toward the sliding door that led to the next train car, she felt the weight of the men's gazes. Ethan pushed the door open. They stepped through. Nick exhaled sharply. Did we lose them? Ethan's face darkened. No. Sarah's stomach turned. She dared glance back. One of the men was following. 3:35 p.m. The desperate gamble. Ethan cursed under his breath. All right. Change of plan. Sarah's voice was tight. Which is? Ethan's eyes locked onto a flashing red button near the emergency exit. Nick's eyes widened. Wait. No. You can't be serious. Ethan smirked. Dead serious, kid. Sarah felt her pulse spike. Ethan, if we pull the emergency brake, we'll have exactly 10 seconds of chaos before these guys realize what's happening. Ethan cut in, which is just enough time for us to jump. Nick gaped at him. Jump? Off a moving train? Ethan grinned. Come on. It's not moving that fast. Sarah's throat was dry. Ethan, this is insane. He arched a brow. Would you rather stay here? Sarah swallowed hard. No, she wouldn't. Behind them, the man was closing in. Ethan grabbed Nick's wrist. On my mark, kid. Nick's face twisted with pure panic. This is a terrible idea. Ethan smirked. Yeah, well, you'll thank me later. Then, he slammed his fist into the emergency brake. 3:36 p.m., the leap of faith. The train screamed in protest. A violent lurch sent passengers flying forward. Luggage tumbled from overhead compartments. People shouted in confusion. Sarah barely had time to react before Ethan shoved her toward the exit. Geo, he barked. Nick grabbed her hand, his face pale. Mom. Ethan didn't give them a choice. He pushed them both out the door. The rush of wind hit Sarah like a wall. For a split second, she was weightless. The ground rushed toward her in a blur of green and brown. Then, impact. Pain shot through her arms as she tumbled down a grassy embankment. Nick rolled beside her, grunting in pain. Ethan landed last, somehow more gracefully than either of them. Sarah gasped, forcing herself to sit up. Her whole body ached. Her heart was hammering. But they were off the train. Nick groaned. I hate you, Ethan. Ethan grinned. That's the spirit. Sarah's head snapped up. The men. The train was still screeching to a halt in the distance. But the two men were already at the doors. And they had seen them jump. Sarah's breath hitched. "We need to run." Ethan pulled her to her feet. "Agreed." Then they took off into the trees. 3:50 p.m. Tom's nightmare. Tom's wrists ached. The ropes around them were too tight. Adrian Calloway stood in front of him. Rolling up his sleeves like this was just another business meeting. "I have to admit, Tom," he mused, "I expected you to be smarter." Tom clenched his jaw. "If you touch my family." Adrian smirked. "Oh, Tom, I don't need to touch them." He pulled out his phone and tapped the screen. A video feed flickered to life. Tom's stomach dropped. It was Sarah and Nick and Ethan running through a forest. Adrian's smirk widened. "See, that's the thing about running, Tom." He leaned in, whispering against his ear. "Eventually, we catch up. 4 p.m., the hunt begins." The forest was dense, branches clawing at Sarah's arms as she pushed forward. Her breathing was ragged, her pulse thundering in her ears. She could hear Nick stumbling behind her, cursing under his breath, while Ethan moved ahead with practiced ease. They had no idea where they were going, but they knew what was behind them. Nick gasped, struggling to keep pace. "Are they?" "They're following," Ethan cut in sharply. "Keep moving." Sarah stole a glance over her shoulder. A flicker of black between the trees. They were closing in. Panic surged through her. "We need to lose them." Ethan's eyes darted around, scanning. Then he grabbed her wrist and yanked her sideways. "This way." Nick groaned. "If this is another one of your genius ideas." "Trust me, kid." Sarah had no choice but to follow. Behind them, voices carried through the trees. Low, sharp, organized. These men weren't just chasing them. They were hurting them. Sarah's heart pounded. They were being funneled. 4:10 p.m., nowhere left to run. Ethan led them to a steep drop, a dried-up riverbed, at least 10 feet down. Sharp rocks jutted from the earth. No clear path forward. Nick skidded to a halt. "Okay, that's a cliff." Sarah spun around. The men in black were stepping through the trees now. Slowly, deliberately. Sarah's stomach twisted. They weren't rushing anymore. They knew there was no way out. One of the men, tall, broad-shouldered, stepped forward, gun in hand. "End of the line," he said calmly. Sarah clenched her fists. Nick's voice shook. "Mom." Ethan exhaled. "Okay, we might be screwed." The man smirked. "You have something that doesn't belong to you." His eyes locked onto Sarah. "Your husband made a mistake. We're here to fix it." Sarah's blood ran cold. "Where is he?" The man tilted his head. "Oh, he's alive. For now." Nick took a step forward, rage flashing in his eyes. "You son of a—" Ethan shoved him back. "Not the time, kid." The man chuckled. "Smart friend you got there." His gun lifted slightly. "Now, let's not make this any harder than it needs to be." Sarah's breath hitched. This was it. No escape. No more running. Then, a snap of a branch. The man froze. A second later, something shot past Sarah's ear. A gunshot. Not from a man in black. From somewhere else. The man in front of them staggered, a red bloom spreading across his chest. He crumpled without a sound. Chaos erupted. More gunfire. The other men shouted, ducking for cover. Ethan grabbed Sarah and shoved her toward the edge of the drop. "Jump." Sarah didn't think. She fell. Nick was right behind her, tumbling down the rocky slope with a grunt. Ethan landed last, barely breaking a sweat. Sarah scrambled up wild-eyed. Who the hell just saved us? Ethan scanned the ridge above them. A lone figure stood at the top, dressed in a dark coat, rifle in hand. A woman, and she was looking directly at Sarah. Ethan's face went still. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered. "It's her." Sarah's heart slammed against her ribs. "Who?" Ethan's smirk returned. "The woman your husband really should have been afraid of." 4:20 p.m., Tom's interrogation. Tom groaned, his head lolling to the side. He had no idea how much time had passed. Adrian Calloway sat in front of him, sipping a glass of whiskey like they were old friends. "You always were reckless, Tom," Adrian mused. "But even I didn't think you'd be this stupid." Tom glared at him. "What do you want?" Adrian smiled, slow and sharp. "That money you stole? You thought it was just about numbers. Just about greed." He leaned forward. But you stole something else too. Tom frowned. What? Adrian exhaled like he was speaking to a child. You stole from her. Tom's breath stalled. No. Adrian's smirk widened. Oh yes. Tom's hands clenched into fists. She's dead. Adrian chuckled. That's what you thought. Tom's chest tightened. No, it wasn't possible. The woman he had betrayed, the one who had sworn to destroy him. She was still alive. And now, she was coming for all of them. 4:30 p.m., the ghost from the past. Sarah stared at the woman standing above them, her breath frozen in her throat. She had expected hired guns. She had expected danger. But not this. The woman's dark coat billowed slightly in the wind. She lowered the rifle, tilting her head slightly, as if sizing Sarah up. Nick wiped blood from his lip. Who the hell is she? Ethan let out a low whistle. You wouldn't believe me if I told you. Sarah's mouth was dry. Try me. Ethan turned to her, and for the first time since this whole nightmare began, he actually looked shaken. Her name's Cassandra Vale. Sarah felt the name hit her like a freight train. Nick frowned. That's supposed to mean something? Ethan exhaled, still staring at the figure above them. Oh yeah. Then, his next words sent a cold shock through Sarah's spine. She's the real reason your husband's been running. Sarah's heartbeat pounded in her ears. She was his partner. Ethan continued, voice grim. Before he betrayed her. Before she died. His smirk returned, but there was no humor in it. Guess she got better. Nick's jaw clenched. So let me get this straight. Dad screwed over a criminal mastermind, thought she was dead, and now she's alive and coming for us? Ethan nodded. That about sums it up. Sarah turned her gaze back to the ridge. Cassandra was still watching, waiting. Then, without a word, she turned and disappeared into the forest. Sarah shivered. They weren't out of danger. Not even close. 5 p.m., the escape collapses. Tom struggled against his restraints, heart hammering. Adrian Calloway smirked as he swirled his whiskey glass. Tom. Adrian sighed, shaking his head. Did you really think you could run from her? Tom's mind was spiraling. Cassandra Vale. He had seen her die. He had been sure of it. But now, a door creaked open. Tom's stomach dropped. Boots clicked against the concrete floor. A shadow moved into the dim light. And then, she stepped forward. Tom felt like the air had been ripped from his lungs. Cassandra stood there, calm, calculating. But her eyes, burned with something dark, something unforgiving. Hello, Tom. Tom swallowed hard. Cass, you're supposed to be dead. Her lips curled into something almost resembling a smile. Yes, that was the plan, wasn't it? She stepped closer, her voice quiet. But I never was very good at dying. Tom struggled to find words, but his throat had gone dry. Cassandra's eyes flicked toward Adrian. Leave us. Adrian hesitated, but then he smirked. Oh, I wouldn't dare interrupt this reunion. Cassandra didn't even look at him. Leave. Now. Adrian chuckled, but he stood. Fine. He's all yours. The door creaked shut behind him. Now it was just them. Cassandra kneeled down in front of Tom, tilting her head. You have no idea how long I've waited for this moment. Tom exhaled sharply. Look, Cass, whatever you think I did. Her expression darkened. You stole from me, she said quietly. You sold me out. You left me for dead. She leaned in, her voice almost a whisper. And then, you lied to your family about it. Tom's pulse skyrocketed. Sarah doesn't know, does she? Cassandra mused. She thinks you're just some idiot who got in too deep. She chuckled. If only she knew the real story. Tom's jaw clenched. If you touch them. Cassandra stood. Oh, I won't have to. She pulled out her phone and held it up. A video flickered on the screen. Sarah, Neek, Ethan, running through the forest. Cassandra's lips curled. They're already walking into my trap. Tom's chest tightened. Please. They don't know anything. Cassandra smiled. Then I suppose we should educate them. 5:30 p.m., the final choice. Sarah, Nick, and Ethan stumbled into an abandoned train station deep in the woods. Sarah's mind was spinning. They had barely escaped the gunman, barely survived the train. And now, she stopped. Nick frowned. What? Sarah turned. Something wasn't right. The train station was empty. Too empty. Then, a single ringtone cut through the silence. Sarah's stomach dropped. Ethan pulled out his phone and swore under his breath. It's her. Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper. Cassandra? Ethan exhaled sharply. She wants to talk. He answered. The voice that came through was smooth, lethal. Hello, Sarah? Sarah's fingers curled into fists. Where's my husband? Cassandra chuckled. Oh, Tom? He's safe. For now. Sarah's breath hitched. What do you want? Cassandra's voice turned cold. I want what was stolen from me. Sarah exchanged a glance with Ethan. We don't have it. Cassandra scared. Oh, but you do. And you're going to bring it to me. Nick frowned. Bring what? Cassandra's voice was eerily calm. You'll find out soon enough. Sarah's heart pounded. And if we refuse? There was a pause. Then I'll start with Tom. Sarah's blood turned to ice. Cassandra sighed. You have 2 hours, Sarah. Don't keep me waiting. The call went dead. The silence was suffocating. Nick exhaled sharply. So what now? Ethan cracked his knuckles. Well, he muttered. We're officially out of good options. Sarah clenched her fists. No more running. No more secrets. It was time to end this. 6 p.m., the final play. Cassandra leaned against the table, watching the seconds tick down. She had spent years planning this moment. And now, Sarah was finally coming to her. A slow smile spread across Cassandra's lips. Let's see what you're really made of, Mrs. Baker. The game was almost over, and only one of them was walking away. 7:30 p.m., the final confrontation. The abandoned warehouse loomed ahead, its steel doors rusted with time. Sarah, Nick, and Ethan stood just outside, the weight of everything pressing down on them. Sarah exhaled sharply. We go in together. No mistakes. Ethan smirked. Oh, sweetheart. There's always mistakes. Nick clenched his fists. Let's just end this. Sarah nodded. They stepped inside. 7:35 p.m., face to face with the devil. The room was dimly lit, and at the center of it, Tom, tied to a chair, bruised but alive. And standing beside him, Cassandra Vadi. She looked unbothered, effortless, even. Dressed in black, her hair pulled back, she radiated power. Her hands rested in the pockets of her long coat, as if this entire situation amused her. Sarah, Cassandra greeted, tilting her head. You made it. Sarah's heart pounded. Where's the money? Cassandra laughed softly. Oh, darling, this was never about the money. Sarah's stomach tightened. Then what do you want? Cassandra's expression darkened. I want justice. Her gaze flicked to Tom, who sat rigid in the chair. For what he did. Tom finally spoke, his voice hoarse. Cass, please. Cassandra raised a finger. We don't beg, Tom. Sarah's mind raced. If you kill him, what do you get? Revenge? And then what? Cassandra smiled. Then I sleep peacefully at night. Sarah took a step forward. You don't need to do this. Cassandra's eyes burned. Yes. Ido. She pulled a gun from her coat. Nick tensed. Mom. Sarah reacted instantly. She lunged. 7:40 p.m., the breaking point. The gunshot cracked through the air. Sarah tackled Cassandra, sending them both crashing to the ground. The gun skidded across the floor. Ethan moved fast, grabbing Nick and shoving him behind a crate. Tom struggled against his bindings. Sarah, Cassandra fought. She was fast, too fast. She flipped Sarah onto her back, pinning her down. You think you're stronger than me? Cassandra hissed. You have no idea who I am. Sarah gritted her teeth. I know exactly who you are. She reached for the discarded gun, just inches away. Cassandra punched her. Stars exploded behind Sarah's eyes. Then, another gunshot. Sarah gasped. Not her. Not Cassandra. Tom. His body jerked in the chair. A dark red stain bloomed across his chest. Sarah's breath caught. Nick screamed. Cassandra staggered back, her expression momentarily frozen. Then slowly she smiled. Well, she whispered. I suppose that's that. Sarah scrambled toward Tom, her hands shaking. No, stay with me. Tom coughed, blood dripping from his lips. His eyes found Sarah's. I'm sorry, he rasped. Sarah's hands pressed against his wound, desperate. You don't get to die, Tom. Not now, but he was already fading. Nick was crying. Ethan stood motionless, jaw clenched. And Cassandra? She simply watched. Sarah turned to her, rage burning in her veins. You killed him, she whispered. Cassandra tilted her head. No, Sada. She took a step back, slipping the still-smoking gun into her coat. He killed himself the moment he betrayed me. She turned toward the door. Ethan tensed. You're just leaving? Cassandra paused. Then, without turning around, she spoke softly. Oh, Ethan. She glanced over her shoulder. I've already won. Then she was gone. 7:50 p.m., the aftermath. The warehouse was silent. Sarah knelt beside Tom's body, hands still shaking, blood soaking through her fingers. Nick was pale, his body trembling. Mom. Sarah swallowed hard. I know. Ethan exhaled sharply. She let us live. Sarah met his gaze. For now. Ethan didn't argue. Sarah gently closed Tom's eyes. She never thought she'd feel anything for the man who had destroyed their lives. But in that moment, she just felt empty. Nick wiped his face, his voice barely above a whisper. What do we do now? Sarah inhaled deeply. Then she looked toward the open door, where Cassandra had vanished. And she knew this wasn't over. Not until Cassandra Vale was dead. Sarah stood. Her voice was steady. We find her. Ethan smirked. Now that's what I like to hear. Nick wiped his eyes. Mom, are you serious? Sarah turned to him. I am done running. She stepped over Tom's body and walked out into the night, determined, unstoppable, because now it was her turn to hunt.